Welcome back again this week. The reason that President Andrew Johnson was impeached was because he had become an obstruction to the conspiracy's plans and was in the process of exposing what they were doing to the country. There were many things about Johnson the average modern conservative would object to, but the man was a patriot in spite of his failings. As vice president, he could not see the conspiracy in the North, but he did see it in the South. In regard to the Southern conspirators, he had exposed it in January 31, 1862. Quoting Johnson about the Southern conspiracy, he said this: "There's been a deliberate design for years to change the nature and genius of this government," unquote. This was in The Great Conspiracy, its origin and history. The book was written to make the case that there was a conspiracy, but claims it was all in the South, with no linkage to the master conspiracy out of the Illuminati. When Johnson saw the problem in the South, he was elevated in the North. When he began to see it in the North, he was smeared. Once he was president, within weeks, Johnson started to see what was really going on and tried to expose it. He set about giving a series of speeches around the country to bring the problem to the American people with wide and enthusiastic acceptance. This was not going to be allowed by the radicals. They organized hecklers in the audience. By the time he appeared in Indianapolis, the hecklers opened the meeting by tearing down the transparencies, firing shots, killing one man and wounding others, and forcing the president to quit the place without uttering a word. The impeachment papers of Andrew Johnson cited a portion of his speech that he gave on August 18, 1866. We have more on this in our book, but a small part of what he said was this, quote, "We have seen this Congress pretend to be for the Union when its every step and act tended to perpetuate disunion and make a disruption of the states inevitable. We have seen a Congress in a minority assume to exercise power which, allowed to be consummated, would result in despotism or monarchy itself," unquote. Johnson was saying that the radical Republicans were destroying the country in the aftermath of the war. Now, you may wish to look up the radical Republicans online. It will open up your eyes to a certain extent. There have been violence in New Orleans, or New Orleans as they like to pronounce it down there, and he addressed that as well. If you will take up the riot at New Orleans and trace it back to its source, you will find out who was responsible for the blood that was shed there. If you will take up the riot at New Orleans and trace it back to the Radical Congress, you will find that the riot at New Orleans was substantially planned. This according to Johnson. Now, the impeachment papers of Johnson were full of the idea of a conspiracy trying to be exposed by Johnson. He was saying that the Radical Congress was preventing the return to the peaceful union that had existed prior to the Civil War, and that an authoritarian government was planned by these congressional radicals, not dissimilar to many in Congress today, right? This was in league with Edwin Stanton and was one of the reasons Johnson fired Stanton as Secretary of War. The quotes from Johnson's speeches were used to make it appear that Johnson was unstable and a conspiracy theorist. The general theme against Johnson was that it was just silly to believe that conspirators in government and the Army would contrive to start a riot in New Orleans as an excuse to bring about an authoritarian rule. He must be drunk. Even today, school histories talk about the idea that Johnson was a drunkard. This smear was widely spread during Johnson's life. Johnson showed his naivety by asking Carl Schurz to tour the South and come up with a plan for rebuilding the South. Schurz returned with a plan for land reform that would have made Mao Zedong proud. Johnson rejected it. Rebuilding the South was not in the plan of the radicals. To them, Reconstruction was needed to change the pesky Southerners from demanding adherence to the Constitution. It was to be the elimination of the old social order, not simply the elimination of slavery, that had already been done. Land reform was to be part of the scheme and laid the foundation to totally socialize the South. Johnson rejected the recommendation, although he had been a supporter of land reform years before. He had even been considered as a candidate for land reform on their ticket years before. His rejection of the Schurz plan was a shock to the land reform socialists. Congress, however, ordered 100,000 copies of the Schurz report to be printed and distributed. It became an important tool of the radical Republicans. Such a book today would be 1,300,000 copies in today's demographics. Impeachment and then a trial before the Senate was instigated by the radical Republicans, but Johnson survived. One of the reasons that Johnson was not found guilty in his trial before the Senate was that some senators did not want to see Benjamin Wade made president. Wade would have succeeded Johnson under the rules of succession at the time. Wade was a radical of the radicals. One of Lincoln's secretaries, John Hay, referred to the radical leaders in the Republican Congress as the Jacobin Club, which included Wade. Wade supported all of the socialist agenda at the time. At the beginning of the war, a joint committee on the conduct of the war was formed with Wade as chairman. This committee hauled up general officers before it if they lost a battle or seemed to be moving too slowly, and then punished them accordingly with the blessings of Stanton. The pressure to find Johnson guilty was immense. The tactic of depriving members of Congress their seats was used if they were suspected of wanting to vote for Johnson. The senators who did not vote Johnson guilty suffered socially, in business, and were driven out of politics by a concerted program against them. Even though Johnson was not found guilty, he became a lame duck president. If Johnson would have won his battle with the radicals, it is improbable that the Constitution would have been amended as it was over the next few years. No Reconstruction, with the South escaping 10 years of harsh treatment. Arrests of private individuals were common enough and served as examples to all that resistance to the United States Army was forbidden. Even with the pen of editors or judges with court writs during this post-war decade came under the sword of the Army. In areas occupied by the Army, both in the North but especially the South, newspapers would not be allowed freedom of press or judges the ability to uphold the U.S. Constitution now that they were supposedly back under its authority. The only real authority was the radicals, backed up by the War Department. Part of the deal in giving the election of 1876 to Rutherford Hayes rather than Samuel Tilton in the Electoral College tie was the promise to withdraw the Army from the South and allow local government to once again operate. As a result, things began to function more normally. Due to the adverse rule of the radical Republicans, the political situation in the southern states became known as the Solid South, where voters supported the Democrat Party and rejected the Republican Party. It was not until the election of 1964 that any areas of the South started to vote Republican, 100 years later. Next week, we will take a course change and discuss the influence of the spiritualist movement